What is eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading in Entity Framework Core? And when should you use them? This is a common interview question, and in order to answer that, it is best to get some coding example. My name is Brogain and welcome to .NET Mastery. If you are new to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. That way you will be notified when I upload new content. Now back to the main question. What is lazy loading, eager loading, and explicit loading? All of these concepts are related to loading the child elements when you have a parent and child entity with foreign key relation using Entity Framework Core. To explain that with example, let me build a small application with Entity Framework Core. Now I will not be going into the details of how to set up the application with Entity Framework Core, but we will do all of that pretty quick and then dive into the main topic. Let me switch back to Visual Studio. I will start fresh here. Let me create a new project. I will select ASP.NET Core Web App MVC application and let me call that EF Core Loading. I will keep the location that I have here, and I am using .NET 8. Now with .NET 8 I am using the preview version, but if you want, you can follow along in .NET 7 as well. We will keep everything simple and hit the Create button. First we need to configure Entity Framework Core in the application. Let me add NuGet package for that. I will have the include pre-release here, but if you are using other version, that is also okay. We will install SQL Server. Let me do that. And I want Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.Tools. Perfect. With that, Entity Framework Core is configured in the project. Next, we need to configure the application settings, and I will add connection string right here. We have a block there. Let me give it a name of default connection, and I will paste my connection string. If you have a different server here, make sure to configure that. I have a random database name here. Let me call that EF Core Loading. That looks good. Next, we need to configure program.cs to use the connection string and configure DB context. We have to add that service in the container. But I need to create a class that will implement DB context first. Let me do that real quick. We will implement the DB context here. That is inside Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore, and we need to pass the DB connection option here to the base class of DB context. That is the default setting for Entity Framework Core. Now that we have created the class, we can add builder.services.addDBContext. We will have the class application DB context here, and in the option we will have use SQL Server. We will extract the connection string and pass it right here. Now again, this is default settings with EF Core, and I will not go into more details right there. Finally, I want to create two models. First model will be a villa model, and inside there we will create few properties. Let me use the data annotation key for primary key. Let me create another class here, which will be villa amenity. So basically each villa will have few amenities, and there will be a one-to-many relation between both the tables. In villa amenity, we will have a villa ID and the navigation property for villa. On top of that, we have name that is required. That looks good. Now we have one-to-many relation. Right here in the villa, each villa can have multiple villa amenity. We will add a collection of villa amenity. That will establish the one-to-many relation between villa and villa amenity. Finally, we need to create both of these tables. I will create DB set for both of them here, and let me seed some records for villa and villa amenity. We will override the on model creating here. Perfect. And there for the villa, we have has data. We can populate some dummy records. This is how you can seed the villa table with records using migration. Let me create a dummy villa here, and let me create 2 more villa properties. And perfect, that looks good. With that, we are creating 3 villas in our record. Let me also create few villa amenities. I do not want you to waste time on watching me type that, so let me paste that here. And perfect. You can see for villa ID 1, we have 4 amenities. For villa ID 2, we have 2 amenities. And villa ID 3, we have 3 different amenities that we added. Let me add a migration and get started. I will call that create villa and villa number and seed table. Perfect, the migration is added, it is creating table, and it is populating data. That looks good. Let me run the command, update database, and then let me switch to SQL Server. Let me refresh the database here, and we should have the new database, that is EF core loading. It has 2 tables, and perfect, both of them are populated. So now we have records in both villa and villa amenity. Now our focus will be to learn eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading. Let me switch back to the presentation here, and first we want to see lazy loading in action. And remember, this is the default behavior with Entity Framework Core. Let me open the controller here, and we want to inject application DB context. So let me do application DB context here. I will call that _DB in the constructor. Perfect. We will be working on the index action method. Great. Initially, let's say we want to fetch all the villas that we have in our database. So we want to load all the villa here. That is pretty simple. The return type, it will be an IEnumerable of villa. Let me call that as villas. Using Entity Framework Core, we can use the DB context, and there we have all the DB set. If we say _db.villas, that will retrieve all the villas, and it will store that in the villas variable. It is simple as that. Next, let's say here we want to count the total. So we have total villas is equal to villas.count. The default behavior of Entity Framework Core is on this line 21. It will not go to the database and retrieve the villa. It will go and retrieve that only when something is accessing a property or accessing the villas itself. We are doing that on line 24, so that is when it will go to the database and fetch all the records. Let me show that. If I run the application here, it will also run a console application. Perfect. You can see we have a console application, and here it will display all the logs. If you go to database, the queries are also displayed by default with Entity Framework Core. If I go back here and press F10, you will notice query is not executed in the console window. On line 24, we are accessing the villas and we are fetching the count of villa. At that point, if I press F10 again, you can see the query was executed. That is known as deferred execution or lazy loading in Entity Framework Core. On line 21, we wrote the command to retrieve all the villas. But once it is retrieved here, it is not being used on this line. That is why Entity Framework Core will defer the execution to a later point when that villa is actually accessed. And that is done on line 24. At that point, it will go to the database and retrieve all the villas, count the number of records, and assign that to total villas. With that, you have seen lazy loading in first example, where it is the default behavior of Entity Framework Core. It loads the data when it is accessed for the first time. Next point, it does not load any child elements if you do not ask for it. If I go back and examine the villas here, result view, you can see the villa amenity, that is a child element of the villa model, and that is not populated because we have not explicitly asked for that. So now the question is, how do we load that villa amenity? That can be done in multiple ways. Let me stop the application here, and we can have a for loop where we are iterating through all the villas based on the count here. Let me paste total villas here. For each of the records, we want to populate villas of I dot villa amenity. We cannot access the index here. For that, it has to be a list. So right here, let me convert that to list. Now because we are converting the underscore db.villas to list here, at this point it will execute the query because we are altering the records that are retrieved. Previously, when it was executing on count, now it will go to database on the .toList right here. On villas of I, we can populate villa amenity. We will make another database call to villa amenities, and there we will have a where condition using Entity Framework Core. We want to say where villa ID is equal to villas of I.id. I will convert that to a list here, and perfect. With that, all the villa amenity will be populated for each villa. Let me run the application and show that. Perfect. Let me also minimize this, and I will bring the console window here. That way we can see all the logs. Perfect. You can see on line 21, we have the query to retrieve all the villa. In the for each loop, we have the execution to get villa amenity based on the ID. Now that will be iterated 3 times because we have 3 villa. In total, you can see we have 4 execution, and basically this is n+1 problem. If you want to retrieve n records, like here we have 3 records, the total query execution will be n+1, that is 4 queries that are being executed right here. And that is how lazy loading will work, because we are loading the villa amenity after we are loading the villas. If you examine the villas now, you will notice their villa amenity is populated. We have 4, we have 2, and we have 3. So that looks good, but this is how lazy loading will work to load the child entities of villa. If I go back to the presentation, you can see multiple queries will be executed for the child elements. That is how lazy loading will work. I already mentioned that, but I will mention that once again. Lazy loading is also known as deferred execution. What we have here can also be simplified with a for each loop. If we are using a for each loop, let me comment this out. We do not need the villa total. We can iterate through all the villas here and directly load the villa amenity like that. That is much cleaner, but if we run the project, result will still be the same. What I mean by that is if I open the console window, you will still notice that we have n+1 execution. For each villa, it is going to retrieve different villa amenity, populate that, and perfect. We are going to database 4 times to load the villas with their individual amenities. Now that you have seen lazy loading in action, what is eager loading? Eager loading, if I go back to presentation, we will load all the data in one single request. We have to use something called as .include method that is provided with Entity Framework Core. And because we are loading all the data in one request, eager loading will return a large amount of data as compared to lazy loading. Finally, because we will be loading everything in one database call, there will be less query execution. Time to see that in action. We will comment out the lazy loading here. Let me add a comment here, lazy loading. And we will have eager loading here. For eager loading, we will have list of villa that we want to retrieve. Let me call that eager underscore villas is equal to underscore db.villas. And there we have something called as .include in Microsoft.entity framework core. And we can say u goes to u.villa amenity. What this particular include statement will do is it will automatically include the navigation property based on the primary key and foreign key relation. If I go to model here, you can notice that in villa amenity, we have a foreign key of the villa ID. So that way villa amenity will be populated only where villa ID matches for all the villa amenity. For villa 1, it will load the 4 amenities that we have. For villa 2, it will load the amenities where villa ID will be 2, and so on. Entity Framework Core will do all the complexity on how it maps everything based on the foreign key relation. Now here we are using a different name. If you want, you can uncomment that. That is also okay. Perfect. Let me run this and see what happens. Let me open the console window here. First time we are retrieving all the villas. That gets executed. Now we are in eager loading where we will retrieve all the villas. On top of that, we want to include villa amenity. If you press F10 here and examine the query, you can see here along with villa, it is also left joining the villa amenity. That way it will retrieve all the details right here. If you examine the records here, you will notice that villa amenities are also populated. Great. With that, you can see how easy and clean eager loading is as compared to lazy loading. The drawback here is, of course, it will return a large data, but the main advantage is we get everything in single query execution as compared to the n+1 execution that we were facing in lazy loading. If we continue here, you can see it executed 3 more times because of the for each condition that we have. So you can see how easy and powerful eager loading is. You can include multiple properties here if you want as well. On top of that, let's say villa amenity also had a child element. Then in EF Core, we have a special extension called then include, and that we can use to include any child properties inside the villa amenity. So that way we can go pretty fancy, but we will keep things simple for now. Last thing that I want to cover is explicit loading, and that applies to related data. Using explicit loading, we will explicitly load the navigation property. That means that it will not load the navigation property on the initial load, and we can load a reference or a collection. What I mean by that is if we go back and if we examine the villa model here, right now the navigation property that we have is a collection. So how do we load that? Using explicit loading. Let me do that right here. First one, let me have that as explicit loading. Let's say we want to load only one villa where the ID is 1. Let me retrieve that using first or default. Then on the underscore db, we have a method that is entry, and we will pass the villa temp that we retrieved. On this villa temp, we have something called as a collection or a reference. We need to populate a collection of villa amenity. Because of that, we will use collection here, and we will explicitly define we want entity framework core to populate the villa amenity, and on there we will call the load method that will explicitly load the villa amenity for this record. Let me add a debugging point and run the application. Let me examine the logs here. Perfect, that is empty. When I press F10 here, it executes the select statement to retrieve villa based on the ID 1. That is okay. Now at this point, if you examine the villa temp, villa amenity is not populated because we have not explicitly asked for that. But here we are saying that, hey, on this villa temp, I want you to figure out how to load the villa amenity collection and populate that. If I press F10 here, you can see a query was executed to retrieve villa amenities. It retrieves that, and now if you examine the villa temp, villa amenity is populated. So what we did on line 26 is explicit loading. We have explicitly told entity framework core that, hey, I want you to load a collection that is villa right here. Let me show you an example to explicitly load a reference. For that, we will retrieve a villa amenity here, and we will retrieve that from villa amenities DB set. If I go back to the database, we have 1 and villa ID is 1 as well. What we will do is on the villa amenity temp here, we want to load the villa navigation property. If I go here, you can see we have a navigation property in villa amenity as well. If I use a collection here, it will not work because we have to load a single entity, and for that we have to use reference. With that, let me run the application again, and let me examine the logs here. We go back, and you will see something odd. Let me press F10 for the first two. We are loading the collection, and then when we are loading the villa amenity for the ID of 1, if you press F10 and examine the villa amenity temp, to your surprise the villa is also populated. Now it did not get populated on line 29. But right here when we were retrieving all the villas, entity framework core already had that, and that way it was smart to add that to our villa amenity right here. But if you comment that out and let me try again, this time it will not be populated. When we get the villa amenity, it is only going to villa amenity, and right here you can see villa is not populated. When we use the reference with explicit loading, it retrieves that villa and populates that right here. With that in place, you can see explicit loading using collection and reference. Now we have the main question on when should we use the individual options that we saw. Lazy loading is typically preferred when you are confident that you do not need to use the related entities instantly. Then we have explicit loading, which works kind of like lazy loading, but we can load that only after making a new explicit call to load the child entities. Explicit loading is very similar to lazy loading when you compare everything because it is going to database again exactly like lazy loading is. A use case for lazy loading or explicit loading would be, let's say you have a collection of entities that you are retrieving, and only for the top entity you want to load the child element. If you are retrieving 100 records and if you only want child element for one record, I will definitely use explicit loading or lazy loading in that scenario. And then finally we have eager loading, where we will load all the entities in one single call. Even though the call would be expensive as compared to lazy loading, I would still prefer that call in most of the scenarios, and the reason is simple. If I go back to my example here, we have an action method where we have multiple execution. The control will go back to the view after we load all the data. It does not matter if on line 21 I use eager loading to load all the data, or maybe I load the parent entity here, and on line 41 we will go back to the database and retrieve all the child element. That is a bad approach because now we are making n+1 database call. In our example, we were going to database 4 times using lazy loading or explicit loading. But if I use eager loading, it will join all the call and hit our database only once, and that will be faster, and you can see the code is also much cleaner. But if you had an application where you are using Ajax call or Blazor, where you can load more data once you scroll down on a page, then lazy loading will make more sense. That is what I have experienced working on multiple applications for quite a few years now. If you have some other scenarios where you have found lazy loading or explicit loading drastically beneficial, let me know in the comments. But like I said, based on my experience with Entity Framework Core, if someone will ask me to pick one in an interview, I would always pick eager loading hands down, unless I had a very good reason on how the other loading will be beneficial. I hope this helps you to get an idea about the differences between eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading. If you have enjoyed the video, do not forget to like the video and leave a comment. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, make sure to do that right now. That way you will be notified right away when I upload the next video. I hope to see you guys in another video. Till then, happy coding!